On today's episode of Behind the Headlines, we're talking about the very complex system of education in this country, and specifically in the state of Michigan. We'll be talking about the school shooting at Oxford, copycat threats, the continued stress of COVID, staffing shortages, school board meetings, and the learning loss for the children wrapped up in all of this. Our guests today, Martin Slagter and Dylan Goetz, will be digging into all of this next. As I said, our guests, Martin Slagter and Dylan Goetz, diving in to the complex education system in the state of Michigan. And as always, our co-host, Vice President of Content, the one and only, the holiday-themed John Hiner. How are you, my friend?
I am well. The holiday spectacular continues here at MLive on Behind the Headlines. If things go a little messy at the end, it's because our holiday party is going to start and the eggnog has been spiked. Anyways, it's been quite a year, Eric, wouldn't you say?
Yes. I was actually saying the other day, we thought 2020 was the year and 2021 was like, hang on, let me show you what a crazy year is really like, because this feels way crazier than last year.
And what we won't do is at the end of this episode talk about how next year it's all going to change, right?
Correct. Yes.
We're not going to use the normal word during this podcast because perhaps this is normal. But one thing that has not changed. One institution that's been very, very stressed throughout the whole year has been our medical system, hospitals. It's deja vu. We're writing a lot of the same stories about emergency rooms overwhelmed. Don't come to the hospital for routine stuff, things like that. But if I had to say a close second as far as institutions that have really struggled, for normalcy during the pandemic, it's schools, public school system. Colleges seem to be getting back to fairly routine, although there's masking mandates and we've had COVID outbreaks. But our public school system in Michigan has been really, really beset by not just COVID, but lots of other issues that maybe have just arisen out of the stress of not being in normal settings. And so I'm not going to run down all the different things myself. I'm going to turn that over to our guests, but being joined today by Marty Slagter, who covers education for the Ann Arbor News and MLive, and then from the Flint Journal, Dylan Goetz, who also covers education. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning. Good to be here.
It's great to have you here. And I was talking about the variety of the kinds of issues that you were handling. The one I think is really present in people's minds is in the wake of the Oxford shooting. We had gone a long time without mass shooting violence, and that tragic event has really brought that back to the headlines. But also, it's created a wave of kind of copycat threats and security issues. So just first and foremost, what's the climate right now in schools in terms of security and what you're hearing from superintendents and other school officials?
Yeah, I'll go ahead. It really seems that, a lot of schools are dealing with this, and, it was only November 30th when the Oxford High School shooting. So we've been dealing with this for 14 days, about 2 weeks about now, and we're still seeing a lot of copycat threats. So almost every school district in Genesee County, where I cover education, closed that same Friday. I think it was December 3rd. And ever since, we've seen, numerous other closings from certain school districts who have investigated threats and, deemed them to be credible enough to shut down. One of the interesting parts about it, though, I was talking to an administrator last week, and they said COVID has actually made it a little bit easier to shut down if needed, because a lot of schools have been using COVID-19 funding from the government to invest in their technology in case, COVID cases ever spike up again, they have the ability to go virtual. That's what a lot of schools have been doing, in this case too, when there's a threat to one of the buildings, they, call it off and send students, some work virtually if needed. So that's been interesting.
Yeah, I would just add the threats have been pretty widespread across the state. I haven't really seen any areas where this isn't happening, and it has been pretty persistent. In fact, there was a threat at Oxford Middle School this morning that ended up canceling classes there. So still a pretty raw situation there. I think one of the things to keep in mind is that this is just another layer of complexity that's been added to the educational landscape on top of all of the other issues that school districts are juggling right now with staffing shortages and on top of COVID-19 outbreaks, and dealing with, some hostile opposition at times from parents and community members who are opposed to things like mask mandates and quarantine policies that they've had to institute to keep teachers, staff, and students safe. So it just adds to, I think, the compounding, stress that's been put on school districts so far this year with the return to more normal in-person classes.
Marty, thanks for cataloging some of the issues that schools have had to deal with. I will say, back to the issue of school, violence or threats of violence, the reaction has been very swift and very, very firm reaction from law enforcement, school districts, and so forth. Even when they're involving middle school age kids, they're taking these things extremely seriously. I think the age of innocence is over for the ideas of schools as this haven. It started with Columbine, but the reactions now is like the tolerance level for this is zero. It was a jarring reminder a couple of weeks ago when this happened. But you listed some of the issues, and I'd like to go into them. One you left out was critical race theory, which is a whole different thread than quarantine policies and masking, but it also has brought angry parents into school board meetings. And Eric, I was wondering when they're just going to cancel school board meetings, because these things have gotten to be circuses, kind of anger-fueled circuses where people show up and direct their ire at people who I think in most cases don't get paid. I think these are volunteers who are trying to help run these school districts. So both of you talked about the stresses, but what's the impact on school systems? What's the impact on school boards? And going into next year, what's the climate for constructive education right now?
Yeah, there was a really big push from a few, Flint is our primary, coverage area at the Flint Journal, obviously, but a couple of the neighboring communities really struggled with parents who were coming out against mask wearing in schools, that sort of thing. There was plenty of protests down Saginaw Street in Flint, which is our kind of main drag. But that kind of combination of different issues that the education realm is facing right now that you, John, and Marty talked about, it's really kind of making a lot of school board members and administrators and even teachers, feel a bit burnt out. It's now been almost 2 years of kind of not knowing what's next due to the pandemic, due to, threats that are coming now after the Oxford High School shooting, due to mask mandates, that sort of thing. I think in recent weeks, especially after the Oxford High School shooting, we haven't seen a lot of attention towards, like people protesting mask mandates and that sort of thing. In Genesee County, the county-wide mask mandate is actually being removed. So when students return from Christmas break, they don't have to wear them anymore. That's according to the county government, but schools can still do their own individual policies as well. But it's really putting this extended pressure for so long on a lot of people in the education industry. It's causing some teachers and administrators to kind of look to their side and say, is this something I really want to do, and how are we doing it the most efficiently so I don't feel burnt out every time I come into the classroom or every time I come to school.
I think we're also, I would add, seeing some of the stress that has been put on parents who are overseeing their kids' education in a virtual or remote format really sort of take a toll on them. I think parents want to see their kids in school. We have also seen parents voice a lot of opposition to things like mask mandates and believing that their personal freedom should be taken into account in constructing the guidance. One of the things that I've seen everything from students walking into classes without masks on with a mask mandate to students walking out of class to demonstrate against mask mandate. We've had school board meetings that have been cut off because parents have taken over public comment, and essentially we're not following any of the guidelines related to that. So it's definitely just an extension of the tension that I think we see in all parts of society. But I believe schools have kind of become this sort of magnet for these discussions because of public meetings and because, frankly, parents are impacted by all of these decisions that are being made by the schools. And when you don't have a kind of a blanket mask mandate like we had last year at the state level, it forces school districts and health departments to make some of these difficult decisions and put mandates in place that are sometimes unpopular with parents.
Yeah, people get a lot more engaged when it's personal, and there's nothing more personal than your kid, especially if you have a family philosophy about certain things. And I mean, having been a reporter, I covered a lot of downtown development board meetings that nobody showed up for when they were extending a tax zone that was going to cost millions of dollars. But you want to change the school lunch period or milk prices, and parents show up. So when you get into something about like what they perceive as safety for their children, I think you're going to see a lot more engagement. And to your point, Marty, I think the tenor of the school board meetings with their shouting and the signs and the anger, it's just a reflection of society in general, at this point, in terms of the differences in the polarization that we have over certain issues. One thing about you mentioned too, labor shortages. And we had a story earlier this winter on a school superintendent, I think it was in Grand Haven, who, due to bus driver shortages, was driving the bus for extracurriculars. And, it wasn't like just a one-time thing as a stunt. There's actual shortages out there. What is the situation on the ground right now? Is it this in part because teachers are checking out, or there's just other better job opportunities for people right now? What's behind that trend?
Yeah. It seems like closures, haven't just come from COVID-19 and threats and that sort of thing, but it seems like every school, at least where I cover and really in the state of Michigan, is fighting with a lack of teachers and support staff. Really, I've seen, tons of job fairs pop up, all over the county and state. A lot of districts are specifically struggling in the transportation department. Odds are, wherever you might be listening to this, in the state of Michigan, your school district is probably hiring bus drivers to train, and bring on staff. I know one school district I cover in Genesee County, they told me last month that they've had to cancel at least one bus route almost every single day this semester, just because, their staff is low. And then on top of that, they have lives too. They have to take days off. They get COVID-19 every once, people have sick days, that sort of thing. They've increased hourly pay benefits, they've added attendance pay even. Schools are really doing everything they can to kind of train and recruit those kind of support staff members, not only teachers.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think schools are doing what they can to try to attract people to the workforce, but I think they're facing the same issues that the labor market across the board is facing. People are just able to be a little bit more selective about their professions right now. And, I think that applies across the board with schools. You look at paraprofessionals, which, need to have a bachelor's degree, are getting $13 an hour. I think those are positions that are starting to be re-examined in terms of the value that they bring to schools, and schools are finding more money for those types of hires. I know personally, I've seen superintendents working in the lunchroom. Ann Arbor Schools Superintendent Janice Swift has taught classes this fall. So people are chipping in, and I think one of the things that maybe people don't realize beyond the staffing shortage is just the lack of a pool of substitute teachers to fill in for teachers when they are off right now. And that's where we have started to see district-wide closures, is where teachers are taking the time off that they normally have, but there's just nobody to fill these spots right now. Operationally, you just see that on a daily basis. Like Dylan mentioned, buses running late because they have to double up routes. And even in the lunchroom, I think we've seen issues without folks being properly staffed. So it's across the board. And I think schools are starting to try to address that with COVID funds to try to make those positions more attractive, but it's going to take a while.
It's interesting that you both have mentioned the COVID funds. Having the money is one thing. Finding the labor force is another. And the jobs that you're talking about are not necessarily the top of the pay scale. You know, the curriculum director, it's down at the worker level, the same place that McDonald's is trying to find people, you know, the $15 an hour jobs or $13 an hour jobs. My daughter is at MSU, and her favorite dining hall closest to her dorm closed because they don't have anybody to work in the dining hall. You know, so first world problems. She has to walk another 2 blocks to eat, but it's being felt everywhere. You're listening to Behind the Headlines, an MLive podcast. Today, we're talking about the stresses on the public education system due to COVID and a host of other reasons. Joining us today are guests Martin Slagter from the Ann Arbor News and Dylan Goetz from the Flint Journal, education writers. Let's talk about educational outcomes. You mentioned you've been in the schools. You're in constant contact with superintendents, probably teachers' unions and others. 20 months into COVID, with really obviously no end in sight that we know of, what has changed, you know, not just the way people are being educated, but the outcomes that we're getting, and how can they measure that? And how do parents have a sense of that their kids are being educated in a way that we used to be used to?
Yeah, that's really interesting point. You know, I think a lot of schools and superintendents that I've talked to, you know, even intermediate school district superintendents who are kind of looking at it, you know, from one step back and looking at a whole county, they're struggling to find out how learning loss and COVID-19 will affect these students in the long run. You know, that's kind of we talked about all the different issues that are facing, you know, education right now, but learning loss is really the overwhelming big one that everybody has in the back of their mind, but they struggle to address just because, you know, they didn't have school today because there was a threat, or, you know, there's 3 teachers out with COVID, and, you know, we want to make sure that all the close contacts are taken care of. You know, we're now coming up on 2 years worth of education where students are, you know, it just hasn't been consistent. You know, even last year, all year, students were home and not spending as much time in the classroom as they normally would just because they're in front of a computer. So that's kind of, it seems to me that that's the big kind of overwhelming issue that is in the back of a lot of, you know, officials' minds. And I'm not sure if there's an easy answer of how to address that right away.
Yeah, I'd say beyond learning loss is just, as you kind of alluded to earlier, is just the mental health portion of kids not having that normal type of school experience for, you know, almost 2 years now. We've already heard from some school districts about the impact of you know, some of those mental health challenges of being isolated, not having, you know, peers for a good portion of time, and the impact that has, particularly with younger students. So I think that's something that's going to have to be addressed over a long period of time in school districts as we move forward. And I think that'll just put a continued emphasis on prioritizing mental health services within school districts. We know that that's going to be necessary anyway, but I think the pandemic has really kind of exacerbated that for students and obviously for parents, but I think students are the ones that they're going to have to really pay close attention to in over a long period of time as this pandemic moves forward.
One highly visible part of the school experience is high school sports. We just concluded a pretty much full high school football season with state championships at Ford Field. And I mean, that looked fairly normal for a lot of athletes. What's the state, though, under the surface of opportunities for other kids, extracurriculars, and are those things coming back the way that the way we know them, or has that been limited?
Yeah, it's a bit of a slow process. I want to try back a little bit to what Marty was saying about you know, school districts trying to address some of the issues, especially with mental health, with COVID-19 funding. The third round of COVID funding, ESSER 3, it's called. It requires school districts to go and reach out to the community to ask, how do we want this spent? And I just did a story last week. Flint Community Schools had a couple forums, and they're really collecting a lot of takeaways from students, not only, but teachers in the district and then parents. One of the biggest responses they've got is more mental health specialists, more people that can not only just help the students in the classroom with counselors, but really the whole family. And back to your question, I think they are coming back a little bit. There's been, more kind of drama and kind of concert like productions. The arts is coming back. It seemed like early on, sports was the big push right away. But everything's a little, everything's just a bit muted with COVID-19 and mask wearing and that sort of thing. Schools are having to find different ways to put on these same productions and do these same, give these students the same opportunities in a way that's safe and really COVID friendly. So
I think also would just add that the availability of the vaccine for ages 5 to 11 is going to open up more opportunities for schools to kind of transition back to that, I guess, more normal or before times, as it's often referred to in education. We're starting to see this kind of metamorphosis back into a more regular school experience through some of those extracurricular activities, with attention being paid to following those health and safety protocols, like things like dances and concerts and things like that. Are still happening with more regularity now. But I think that there is a certain level of experience that school districts have gained over the past year and a half of practice of trying to make some of these very essential parts of the educational experience happen, like social events. And I think you'll see that continue to become more normal as we move forward.
Before times. That's just poignant and sad.
It is a very sad buzzword, but yeah.
Before times. Was that one word or two, Marty?
Oh boy, I don't know.
Well, I'll just tell you from our perspective, and this won't surprise either of you guys. You work for MLive. We went through that first period where he said, "Oh boy, we're working from home and we got to make do, but we're going to go back." And then you start changing things, and then you go to this phase where you realize when and if we go back isn't going to be before times. It's going to be new times, and things will be different. It doesn't mean they're not bad. It's just in any human endeavor that lasts this long, we're going to learn things and adapt. How is education going to look different in the after times for the next kids coming through? I mean, how are schools permanently going to change due to what they're learning now?
I think it's kind of what we talked about before with that same kind of flexibility. I mentioned that a lot of schools are using COVID funds to upgrade technology and upgrade. Many schools now have 2-to-1 Chromebooks per student. So they have one Chromebook at the school, and then students are also able to take one Chromebook home. That's still the school's property, but they're able to do homework from there. They're able to send emails, that sort of thing. And that, along with a lot of schools, have to provide, Wi-Fi hotspots, that sort of thing. So it's just that flexibility, really, to work in different spaces. And, like a lot of people have said, the snow day is no more. And that's why, is because now students have the opportunity to learn at home, and teachers have the capacity for it. Teachers are used to it now. Which is really interesting to see. I'm not sure if that means that schools are just going to do 4 days, in class, and then one other day virtual every week. But that is a possibility now, and it's something that we now have the infrastructure for that you never did before.
Yeah, those are all good points. I would add, I'm just keeping an eye on staffing and teachers, and are we going to have enough people to keep school operations going? If the pandemic has shown anything, is that it's really kind of spread school districts thin. We've seen schools trying to do innovative things, like provide incentives for paraprofessionals to get a fast track to become teachers and earn their teaching certificates. I think you're going to see more programs like that kind of remove barriers for people who are involved in the school operations to be able to become teachers and kind of advance within the school district in the future and kind of try to grow their own staff. As we've seen that a little bit in Washtenaw County, but it's a slow moving process. So it's really going to come down to what school is going to look like is going to depend on how many people are going to choose to be involved in this profession going forward. So that'll certainly be interesting to watch to see if we still have the same levels of college graduates coming into this profession to match those that are leaving the profession. And right now, those numbers aren't adding up. So looking forward to some innovative solutions to see to help schools properly staff going forward.
You talk about innovative. I think reporters like you have had to innovate in this climate as well. How is it's been 20 months. How has your job changed covering schools? You mentioned several times in this podcast going into the school. So clearly you can get back on the ground. But what are the challenges you face in your job in trying to portray the stories, accurately portray these stories of changes in schools?
Yeah, I've always been, ever since I graduated, I've always been a big proponent of going somewhere, wherever you're doing the story, going there and at least seeing it for yourself, even if that doesn't mean you're going to get an extra source. It means that you kind of feel the atmosphere a little bit. And really early on in the pandemic, that was so difficult. I mean, you weren't allowed anywhere. It was a lot of phone calls, but now things are starting to ease up a bit. I often tell my sources, that I'm vaccinated in case you have, and I'll wear a mask and, et cetera, in case there's any hesitance there. But luckily in the past few months, most schools are kind of set in stone with their COVID-19 policies and are a little bit more willing to let guests in. So it hasn't really been an issue, but early on it was really tough to be places. We were reporting on a lot of different stories. Obviously, the first few weeks of the pandemic was crazy, but a lot of that we were all doing from our bedrooms or our home offices, so it's good to be able to kind of get out and see some faces and meet some people, as we kind of get further and further away.
I would say one of the biggest challenges has been trying to balance these kind of heavy subjects and emotionally charged type of topics, and making sure there's representation from people who are bringing up these issues to schools, but also trying to provide context about why the school districts are doing what they're doing to try to keep staff and students safe. And so it's kind of a difficult balance when you see so many different types of parent groups speaking out in opposition to what's happening in school districts, and how much of a platform do they get, as opposed to the parents who are just happy with what schools are doing and don't typically voice all of their complaints online and things like that. So it's really been about trying to understand to what degree these issues are issues at the school district level, and trying to portray these kind of heated debates as accurately as possible.
Well, in preparation for this podcast, I went and read a lot of school stories from around state and MLive. I like the listeners to believe I read every story every day as they come out, but I had to do a little catching up, and I just really, the themes are the same all over the state. There's a lot going on in schools right now. They're a focal point for a lot of what's happening in society. I thank you both, Marty and Dylan, for the work you're doing, and thank you for joining Behind the Headlines today. I hope you all have a happy holiday with your family. Get some relaxation at the end of the year here. Get your school break in. And we'll see you back in 2022. Eric, thank you.
And there they go. Thanks to Dylan and Martin for joining us today and tackling a very complex and difficult subject. As always, if you like what John and I are doing, like, subscribe, and share wherever you get your podcasts. He is John Hiner. I am Eric Hultgren, and this is Behind the Headlines.